It wasn't supposed to feel this way, like I'd made the worst decision of my life. The house should have been the start of something better, a fresh beginning, a chance to get out of the grind, save up, and finally launch the business I'd been dreaming about since college. I'm 25, too young to feel like my life's already slipping through my fingers, right? When I found the ad, it felt like fate. Charming house on the outskirts of town, dirt cheap rent. The price was a joke, a few $100 a month for the whole place. It had quirks, sure, but I figured I could handle quirks. The landlord was this hunched, leathery guy who smelled faintly of mothballs. During the walkthrough, he barely said a word, just pointed out rooms with a vague wave of his hand. The kitchen, small but functional. The living room, dusty but solid. The upstairs? Fine if you didn't mind peeling wallpaper and creaky floors. And then there was the basement. The door stood at the end of the hallway, a hulking slab of steel that looked ridiculously out of place in this sagging, paint-peeling house. It wasn't just that it was new. It felt out of place, wrong somehow. "Nothing interesting down there," the landlord said, almost offhand. His voice was scratchy, the kind of tone people use when they're repeating something they've said 100 times before. Best to leave it alone. I remember nodding, pretending I wasn't curious, and brushing it off. I figured it was just some old storage space, maybe even an old storm shelter. What else could it be? The first night in the house was uneventful, but uneventful in the way that feels too quiet. No neighbors blasting music through the walls. No city traffic rumbling in the distance. Just the occasional creak of the house settling and the faint hum of the refrigerator. I thought I'd sleep like a rock, but instead, I lay there, staring at the cracked ceiling, feeling off, like I was being watched. When I woke up the next morning, the steel door was the first thing I noticed. It stood out even more in the daylight, gleaming faintly at the end of the hallway. Something about it bugged me, how solid it looked, how secure. Why would anyone need such a heavy-duty door in a house like this? I told myself to let it go. I wasn't here to poke around in someone else's business. I was here to save money, focus on my plans, and build a future for myself. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Days turned into a week, and I settled into a routine. Mornings were for scribbling out business ideas, afternoons for errands in town, evenings for pacing the living room, trying to figure out how to make my dreams line up with my bank account. And the whole time, the door was there, a constant presence in the back of my mind. At first, it was just a nagging curiosity. But then the house itself started to change. Little things here and there. I started hearing noises, faint vibrations, like something deep below me was humming. At night, it was worse, soft, muffled sounds that seemed to come from the basement. It wasn't just noise, though. Sometimes, I'd feel it. A faint vibration under my feet, as if the house itself was alive and restless. I told myself it was just the pipes, or the wind, or maybe even my imagination. But then the whispers started. At first, I thought the whispers were in my head, those late-night moments where your mind plays tricks on you. But they didn't stop. Some nights, they were faint, like a breeze brushing past my ears. Other nights, they were clearer. They didn't make sense. Soft, fragmented words, just barely audible, but enough to send chills creeping down my spine. They always seemed to come from the basement door. I tried to ignore it. I really did. I'd blast music, keep the lights on, even talk to myself just to drown out the noise. But there's only so much you can do before curiosity eats away at you. It wasn't until I found the diary that everything changed. It was a gray, rainy Sunday. I'd decided to clean out some of the junk the previous tenant left behind, hoping a little organization would help me feel less on edge. Upstairs, tucked in the back of a closet, was an old, beat-up cardboard box filled with random junk. Broken picture frames, crumpled newspapers, and a stack of faded magazines that smelled like mildew. Beneath all of that was the diary. It was small, bound in cracked leather, with pages that had yellowed and curled at the edges. I opened it without thinking, figuring it'd be full of grocery lists or doodles. The first page hit me like a punch to the gut. "This house is cursed." I froze. My heart thudded in my chest as I read the words again. felt like the book was staring back at me, daring me to keep going. And I did. The entries were written by a man named Gregory. He'd moved into the house with his wife and 2 kids a few years ago. The first few pages were harmless enough. Notes about settling in, his excitement for a quieter life, little observations about the house and its quirks. But then, just a few entries later, he mentioned the steel door. "It doesn't belong here," he wrote. "It's too new, too cold. The landlord said to leave it alone, but I can't stop thinking about it. Sometimes, I swear I hear things coming from behind it." I set the diary down, my pulse racing. It was unsettling, reading my own thoughts mirrored in someone else's words. But I couldn't stop. Gregory's entries grew darker as the days went on. He described strange happenings, objects moving on their own, shadows flitting across the walls, cold spots that seemed to follow him around the house. His children complained about nightmares, always the same one. A tall, dark figure standing at the foot of their beds. I could feel myself starting to sweat, even in the chilly room. Every word felt heavier than the last. Then came the part about the voices. "I heard them last night," Gregory wrote. "My wife and kids, calling to me from behind the door. But it wasn't them. Couldn't have been. They were upstairs, sleeping. I know they were. But the voices, they sounded so real." I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. The final entry made my stomach churn. "I can't take it anymore." I opened the door. It wasn't them behind it. It wasn't anything that should exist. "If anyone finds this, please don't make the same mistake I did. Leave this place. Don't open the door." The words were frantic, scribbled across the page in shaky handwriting. And beneath them was a dark, faint stain. Something I didn't want to think too hard about. I closed the diary, my hands trembling. My brain felt scrambled, caught between disbelief and a gut-deep certainty that Gregory hadn't been lying. For hours, I paced the house, the diary still clutched in my hands. The whispers had started up again, faint and persistent, like the house knew what I'd just read. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind, sent my nerves into overdrive. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of the door, standing wide open, with nothing but darkness on the other side. I woke up in a cold sweat, the whispers louder than ever. And this time, the basement door vibrated. It was subtle, just a faint tremor, but enough to send my heart into my throat. The diary's warning echoed in my head. Don't open the door. But the more I told myself to leave it alone, the stronger the pull became. I couldn't stay away from the door. I tried everything. Leaving the house, going for long drives, keeping myself busy with errands or work. But no matter where I went or what I did, the door was always there, looming in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't get rid of. Night, it was worse. The whispers became relentless, filling the silence with their maddening cadence. They weren't words, not exactly, but they had a rhythm, a rise and fall that tugged at something deep inside me. And the vibrations, those subtle, almost imperceptible tremors coming from the basement, they weren't just in the floor anymore. I could feel them in my chest, my teeth, my skull. By the end of the week, I wasn't sleeping. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining for the slightest sound. It didn't help that the diary sat on my nightstand, like a silent dare. Every time I looked at it, I thought about Gregory's warning, don't open the door. But what if he'd been wrong? What if he'd seen something else? Something that only seemed terrifying because he didn't understand it? I told myself I didn't believe in curses. Whatever was behind that door had to be explainable, logical. Maybe an old safe room or some kind of underground bunker. Maybe the noises were just the old house settling. But deep down, I knew none of that was true. The door didn't belong here. By the 8th night, I snapped. It was close to midnight, and the whispers had grown louder than ever. An endless tide that seemed to seep into the walls, the floor, my very skin. I tried everything. Music, earplugs, anything to drown them out. But nothing worked. And then the lock clicked. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. The sound was faint but unmistakable. The soft, mechanical shift of tumblers falling into place. I sat up in bed, the blankets bunched around me. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe I was so sleep-deprived that I was hearing things. But then I heard it again. Another faint click, followed by a low, metallic creak. The basement door was opening. I don't remember leaving my bed. 1 second I was frozen in place, and the next I was standing at the top of the stairs, staring down at the hallway. The door was still shut, but it looked different. It wasn't just the way it gleamed faintly in the dim light. It was the way the air around it seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising off asphalt. I stepped closer, every instinct in my body screaming at me to stop. The whispers grew louder with each step, wrapping around me like a net. I swear I could hear my name now, buried beneath the noise, repeated over and over in soft, urgent tones. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The lock mechanism was no longer closed. The intricate system of gears and bolts was partially undone, its pieces shifting faintly as though alive. The whispers pressed harder, their tone almost pleading. I reached for the handle. My hand hovered there for what felt like an eternity, the cold metal just inches from my fingers. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like my chest might burst. I could feel the pull now, stronger than ever, dragging me forward. I tightened my jaw, took a deep breath, and pulled my hand away. "No," I whispered, though my voice barely sounded like my own. "Not yet." I turned and bolted back upstairs, slamming my bedroom door shut behind me. For the rest of the night, I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, clutching the diary like a lifeline. The whispers never stopped, and neither did the door. Every so often, I'd hear it. A faint vibration, a soft creak, as though something behind it was testing the limits of its confinement. By dawn, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living like this. I had to open it. By morning, the decision was made. I couldn't take another sleepless night, another second of that maddening pull. Whatever was behind that door, I had to face it. I told myself it was practical. I needed to know what I was dealing with, whether it was a gas leak, some kind of old machinery, or just my own paranoia. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. This wasn't about logic. It was something darker, deeper. I drove into town and picked up the tools I'd need. A crowbar, a heavy-duty flashlight, bolt cutters. The cashier gave me a curious look as I checked out, but I didn't care. I just needed to be prepared. Back at the house, the door seemed almost eager. I can't explain it. It wasn't moving, but something about it felt alive, like it was waiting for me. The air around it was heavier, colder, pressing down on my chest with every breath. I stood there for a long time, tools in hand, staring at the door like it might lash out at me. My palms were slick with sweat, and my heart was hammering so loud I was sure it echoed in the empty hallway. "Let's get this over with," I muttered, my voice shaky. The lock was the first thing to go. The mechanism was complex, intricate, but it had already started to come apart on its own. I barely had to use the bolt cutters before the final pieces gave way with a metallic snap. Then came the door itself. It was heavier than I expected. When I pushed against it, it groaned like something ancient and reluctant. I had to throw my shoulder into it, and even then, it only budged an inch at a time. When it finally opened, the cold hit me first. A sharp, biting chill that stung my skin and made my breath puff out in pale clouds. The smell came next. It was faint at first, a metallic tang mixed with damp earth, but as the door swung wider, it grew stronger. Rotting fruit, sour and sickly, with an undercurrent of something else. Something I couldn't place but instinctively hated. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it into the darkness. The beam cut through the black, revealing a narrow set of stone stairs descending into the void. The walls were rough and uneven, slick with moisture that glinted faintly in the light. Every part of me screamed to shut the door, to walk away, but I couldn't. The pull was stronger now, tugging at me like an invisible hand on my chest. I stepped inside. The first step was hesitant, cautious. The stone was cold and damp beneath my shoes, and the air grew colder with each step I took. The whispers were back, faint and rhythmic, like a low chant that seemed to echo from deep below. They weren't chaotic this time. They were purposeful, almost melodic, and they wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a long corridor. I swept the flashlight beam across it, and my stomach lurched. The walls were no longer rough stone. They were smooth, polished metal, gleaming faintly in the flashlight's glow. They didn't look like they belonged to a basement or even a house. They were too perfect, too precise, as though they'd been made by something far beyond human hands. I stepped forward, my shoes echoing against the metallic floor. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing against me like an unseen weight. The smell of rot was stronger now, clinging to the back of my throat and making me gag. And then the whispers shifted. They were louder here, clearer, and they were no longer just voices. They were calling my name. Hearing your own name whispered in a place like that, it's hard to explain the kind of fear it triggers. It's not just a shiver down your spine. It's deeper, primal, like every part of you is screaming to turn back, to run. But I didn't run. Couldn't. The corridor stretched on, impossibly long, its polished metal walls gleaming faintly in the glow of my flashlight. The whispers surrounded me, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. They weren't frantic or hostile. They were soft, almost coaxing, pulling me further in. The floor beneath me didn't feel right. It looked solid, but every step had a strange give to it, like walking on thick rubber or something alive. I forced myself to keep moving, the beam of my flashlight trembling as my hands started to sweat. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a faint shimmer at the edge of the light, like a heat wave rippling through the air. I stopped, squinting, trying to make sense of it. But the longer I stared, the more it moved. It was a shadow, tall, thin, and unnatural. Its edges flickered and warped, as though it was struggling to hold its shape. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow didn't move closer. It just stood there, watching. But I could feel it, its presence pressing against me like an icy wind. My chest tightened, and my legs threatened to buckle beneath me. "Who's there?" I blurted, my voice cracking. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it shifted, melting into the wall like smoke. My flashlight flicked across the spot where it had been, but there was nothing there, just smooth, gleaming metal. I wanted to turn back then. Every instinct screamed at me to climb the stairs, slam the steel door shut, and never look back. But I didn't, because the whispers had changed. They weren't calling my name anymore. They were showing me things. Memories. I don't know how to explain it, but as I stood there, staring down that endless corridor, I started feeling moments from my past. Moments I'd buried, forgotten, or ignored. I felt the sting of my dad's disappointment when I dropped out of college. I felt the heartbreak of losing my best friend in that car crash 3 years ago. I felt the weight of every failure, every missed opportunity, every mistake I'd ever made. And I heard their voices, my dad's sharp and cold, my best friend's warm and familiar, even hers, the girl I'd loved, the one I'd pushed away because I was too afraid of letting someone get close. They weren't memories anymore. They were here in the whispers surrounding me. I staggered forward, desperate to drown them out. The corridor seemed to stretch forever, but there was something ahead now, a faint, pulsing light. I followed it, each step heavier than the last. The air grew colder, denser, pressing down on me like I was walking underwater. My flashlight started to flicker, its beams struggling against the darkness. Then the light ahead grew brighter, illuminating the end of the corridor. A door. It was massive, even larger than the steel door upstairs, and it didn't belong in this world. Its surface was black, smooth, and polished like obsidian, but it rippled faintly, as though it were alive. Strange symbols were etched across it, glowing with an eerie, pulsing light. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as though they were trying to tell me something. The pull was unbearable now. It wasn't just a tug on my chest. It was a gravitational force, dragging me toward the door, urging me to open it. I stepped closer, my hand reaching out before I even realized what I was doing. The black surface was impossibly cold beneath my fingertips, sending a jolt through my arm that made me gasp. The symbols began to shift, rearranging themselves into patterns that were almost familiar, almost readable. They pulsed in time with the whispers, their glow brightening as my hand lingered on the surface. And then the footsteps started. At first, I thought they were mine, echoing back at me. But they weren't. They were behind me, slow, deliberate, and heavy. I spun around, the flashlight beam jerking wildly. The corridor behind me was empty, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer. My pulse thundered in my ears as I backed toward the door. The whispers reached a fever pitch, their tones urgent and frantic. I swept the flashlight behind me again, desperate to find the source of the sound. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and thin, its shape flickering and shifting like a broken projection. It moved with an unnatural, jerking rhythm, its limbs elongating and retracting with every step. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, I saw its face. It wasn't a face at all, just a void, an empty, gaping void. I stumbled back, my shoulder hitting the black door behind me. The symbols flared, their glow spilling out into the corridor and lighting up the figure. It stopped, tilting its head as though studying me. Then it smiled. That smile, it wasn't natural. It wasn't something meant for a human face. It stretched impossibly wide, cutting across the featureless void where its mouth should have been. No teeth, no lips, just a jagged curve of nothingness that somehow radiated malice. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I stumbled backward. The door behind me pulsed in response, its symbols glowing so brightly now that the light made me squint. The figure didn't move closer, but I could feel its presence pressing down on me like a crushing weight. My legs felt like lead, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. The whispers had shifted again. They weren't random anymore, they were pleading. Don't let it in. The words slammed into me, cutting through the fog of terror clouding my mind. They weren't coming from the figure. They were coming from the door. For the first time, the pull I'd felt since I opened the basement door seemed to change. It wasn't dragging me toward the door now. It was holding me back, as if warning me. The figure took a step forward. Its limbs bent at impossible angles, elongating and twisting with every movement. The sound of its steps was wrong, wet and sticky, like something heavy being dragged through mud. I pointed the flashlight at it, desperate to hold it at bay. The beam flickered weakly, barely cutting through the darkness now. I didn't realize I was shaking my head until my neck started to ache. No, I muttered, the word tumbling out of me like a reflex. No, no, no. The figure tilted its head again, as if amused. Then it stepped forward again, closer this time. The door pulsed harder behind me, its symbols rearranging themselves faster and faster, creating patterns I couldn't understand but felt deep in my gut. Open the door, the whispers urged, sharp and insistent now. The pull returned, yanking at me with an almost physical force. My hands moved before I could think, pressing against the rippling black surface of the door. The symbols flared, blindingly bright. The figure hissed. It was the first sound I'd heard it make, and it made my skin crawl. The hiss wasn't a normal sound. It was layered, discordant, like a dozen voices speaking at once, all out of sync. I felt something behind me shift, and the door gave way. A sharp wind rushed past me, freezing and foul, carrying a metallic tang that made me gag. The light from the door spilled into the corridor, bathing everything in a sickly red glow. The figure recoiled, its form flickering and distorting like a broken signal. For a moment I thought it might retreat, but then it lunged. I screamed, falling backward through the open door as the figure's twisted limbs reached for me. The last thing I saw before the world went black was its smile, stretching even wider as the door slammed shut. I didn't hit the ground. I don't know how long I fell, seconds, minutes, hours. The air around me was thick and cold, pressing against my skin like a heavy, suffocating fog. When I landed, it was soft, too soft. I opened my eyes and immediately wished I hadn't. The ground beneath me wasn't stone or metal. It was flesh, warm, wet, and pulsing with a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. Veins the size of tree roots snaked across the surface, glowing faintly with the same sickly red light as the door. I scrambled to my feet, my stomach lurching at the squelching sound it made. My shoes sank slightly into the ground with every step, as if I were walking on something alive. The air was worse. It was heavy and damp, reeking of rot and copper, and it clung to my lungs with every breath. Above me, the sky, or what passed for it, was black and endless. No stars, no moon, just an infinite void. And then I heard it, a low, wet gurgling sound, coming from somewhere far ahead. The corridor was gone, replaced by a winding path that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The walls on either side were made of the same pulsating flesh as the ground, veined and alive, shifting with every thrum of the unseen heartbeat. I didn't want to move. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to pretend I didn't exist. But the sound came again, closer this time. I didn't have a choice. I started walking, each step sending ripples through the ground. The path twisted and turned, narrowing in places until the walls were nearly brushing my shoulders. The further I went, the louder the sound became, a wet, slithering noise that made my stomach churn. And then, ahead of me, something moved. A massive shape slithered into view, coiling and writhing in the faint red glow. I couldn't make out any details. Its body seemed to shift and ripple, like it was made of shadows and flesh. And then it opened an eye. Behind me, the eye let out a sound that shook the air, a guttural primal roar that reverberated through the void. The ground lurched violently, throwing me to my knees. When I turned back, the eye was changing. Its smooth surface fractured, splitting into jagged cracks that oozed a thick, black ichor. The massive, writhing form behind it convulsed, its shape breaking apart into smaller, shadowy fragments. The whispers returned, but they weren't coherent anymore. They were screams, angry, desperate, and hollow. The ground beneath me began to collapse, chunks of the fleshy surface crumbling into the void below. I scrambled to my feet, the diary still clutched in one hand, and ran. Every step felt like a battle. The path to the door twisted and shifted, the walls closing in around me, but the light from the symbols guided me. It was steady, unwavering, cutting through the chaos like a thread I could follow. Behind me, the eye screamed again. I didn't look back. When I reached the door, the warmth of the diary flared one last time, and the symbols shifted, forming a pattern I could almost understand. The whispers grew louder, but now they weren't coming from the eye. They were coming from the door. "Go," they urged. "This is your chance. Go." I didn't hesitate. I stepped through the door. The diary's warmth flared in my hands, burning so brightly that I thought it might sear my skin. The symbols on the door pulsed in response, their glow intensifying until they lit up the entire space. Behind me, the eye screamed, a guttural, otherworldly sound that seemed to split the air itself. The ground buckled and heaved, the walls collapsing inward, but I didn't move, couldn't. All I could do was hold onto the diary as its warmth engulfed me, filling my chest with a searing light that drowned out everything else. The whispers vanished. The eye's screams grew fainter, fading into silence as the light from the diary swallowed the world. And then there was nothing. I woke up to sterile, white walls and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. My head throbbed, my mouth dry as sandpaper. My arms were heavy, weighed down by thick straps that pinned me to the bed. Panic flared in my chest as I struggled against the restraints, the faint scent of disinfectant stinging my nose. I wasn't in the house anymore. I was in a hospital. No, not just any hospital. A mental hospital. The door to the room opened, and a nurse walked in, her movements calm and deliberate. She didn't look surprised to see me awake. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Good to see you're up, Alex," she said. "You've been here a while." I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry. The words stuck, caught somewhere between confusion and fear. What had happened? How had I gotten here? The last thing I remembered was the light, the diary, the thing behind the door. The nurse checked a chart at the foot of my bed, scribbling something down. "You've been through a lot," she said, her tone soothing. "But you're safe now." Safe. The word felt hollow, meaningless. I turned my head, scanning the room for answers, for anything that might tell me how I'd ended up here. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, half hidden in shadow, stood a familiar steel door. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same door, the same hinges, the same cold, metallic sheen. Even the lock, though closed, looked slightly off-kilter, as though it had been tampered with. The nurse didn't seem to notice it, or maybe she was ignoring it entirely. My heart raced as I stared at the door, dread pooling in my stomach like ice water. It was waiting for me, the creature behind it, the whispers, the pull. I hadn't escaped. I'd never escaped. The nurse's voice faded into the background as the door began to hum faintly, the sound just loud enough to reach my ears. It was subtle at first, but as I watched, the door seemed to shimmer, its surface rippling ever so slightly. The glow I'd seen before, the glow that had saved me, flickered faintly at the edges of my vision, but it was weak now, barely there. There was no escaping it. There never had been.